College Football Nerds here talking Georgia and Florida. I think we cover this game pretty much every year, Josh. It's a huge one. I've got Josh with me. I'm back from vacation. If y'all are watching some of our previews or live show last week, you didn't catch me. We are doing a live show again this week, and we're doing something a little different. That late, like 7:30 Eastern, 7 p.m. Eastern game, we're kind of letting that one finish before we go live, so we're not having to do play-by-play and being super distracted. Kind of bringing back some college football final for y'all. So check that out. We're going to be there Saturday night, probably around 10:45 Eastern, but we'll be there talking live with y'all. Got some homework for y'all as we get into this discussion. One, let us know in the comments what you think the score is going to be. And two, and this is a question I'm going to give you, Josh, who is Georgia this year? The team that beat the absolute pants off of Oregon, or the team that struggled with Kent State and Missouri? So, Josh, I want to get that question out of the way for you. We've both got Georgia number 2 in our poll, ahead of Bama, ahead of Tennessee, right behind Ohio State. There are some questions there, but also, Georgia fans will say Ohio State ain't played nobody, Paul. But Georgia has had 2 struggle games. So, who is Georgia this year? Is it the team that absolutely slayed Oregon, or is it that team that really struggled with Kent State and Missouri? Or are there some numbers floating around that make you not so concerned, if you're a Georgia fan, with those struggle games in the middle of their season?
Well, I think the answer is, if you like and subscribe to the video as a Georgia fan, then Georgia's actually the best team that's ever played football this year. And if you don't, then then it's terrible and they're going to lose every game. No, I think the answer is always somewhere in the middle. And this year, more than any other year in recent memory, teams shouldn't be defined by their worst game. And that's what everybody wants to do. They want to say, oh, Georgia, man, that Kent State game. Oh, Ohio State, man, that Notre Dame game. Oh, it just roll on down the list. Everyone is defining every team by their worst performance, and it's not realistic. I think college football has kind of caught back up to itself a little bit, where defenses on an on-day can slow the other team down, give them problems. And the more defenses have control and power, the more that those games sort of happen. And at the flip side, you still have all the RPO stuff where offenses can just blow up. And it's very, very hard these days to shut down high-level offenses. So I don't think Georgia is the team that they were, people think they are from the Kent State game. I've defended them a lot in that regard. I mean, Georgia had, they weren't putting them away, but they had a 26-13 lead over Kent State at the half. They never gave up that 2-score lead. They just failed to put them away. It was sort of a similar situation in Missouri up until the final real end of the game. And in both cases, there were mistakes that, yes, they are real mistakes that happen in a game that have to be attributed to Georgia. But, like Kent State, 3 turnovers, and it was the turnovers that kept Kent State in the game. Same thing happened with the Missouri game. Several turnovers. The turnovers kept Missouri in the football game. I don't think those are things that you should really count on from a projection quality standpoint, because, and this goes back to, again, you're not your worst game, right? If there's a game where you turn the ball over 4 or 5 times in a game, right? Alabama versus Texas A&M, turned the ball over, I think it was 5 times. That will cause you to lose a game. If you lose the game, then you deserve to be seen as a team that has that loss. It is a bad loss. If you win the game and you move on, and Georgia in these 2 games was -2, -3 in the turnover margin, I take it as a thing in isolation. If it's not happening every single week, that just tells me, hey, that was your C performance. That was your C- performance. Maybe it was your D+ performance, and you still won the football game. And you're not going to roll out a D+ performance every week. That's why it's a D performance. So I don't think Georgia's that team. I don't think Georgia's the team that they were just against Missouri and against Kent State. They did destroy Oregon. Oregon looks like the best team in the Pac-12 overall. I think it's funny that people keep trying to discredit that, and I know we at the time said, right, that Oregon, we thought, played like junk in that game. There were guys wide open constantly, and it's one thing to say, you've got a contested pass and you're breaking up a ball, and it's another thing when the guy's wide open, right? It's the inverse of the situation with Iowa and Ohio State, right? That Ohio State was in good coverage, but then Petras threw the ball 10 feet over his head. That's a positive for Ohio State in my book because I'd see the guy on him and he'd be tight. But it didn't really matter how close that coverage was. They weren't completing the pass. He could have been open by 20 yards. And with Oregon, there were a lot of plays in that game where guys were just open by 20 yards. And when Georgia needed to, yeah, they'd hurdle a guy and run down the field, and Darnell and Washington would take their manhood and run off with it. But they never really got anything going with Franklin, their big speedy receiver, and their defensively were a mess. So I think Georgia's somewhere in the middle. They are not the worst result they were. They aren't the best result against Oregon, but I also don't think you can throw that Oregon result out.
So on the flip side, Vegas has got a big number on this. And one of the things that gives me pause, and I want you to tell me if you think is realistic, is Florida feels like a team that doesn't produce very well. And maybe this gets us into the model. But Florida is a team, in terms of per play numbers, not super impressive, but not terrible. And when you watch them anecdotally, it feels like, man, the offensive identity is a little bit lacking, and you don't feel comfortable if they need to drive the field to get some points. If they get the ball on their 25-yard line and they don't have some explosive play that gets them in field goal range, they're going to punt the ball. That's how I feel with Florida right now because of the lack of identity. But I also feel like in those maybe mediocre numbers, they're finding points regardless because Anthony Richardson is going to bust off an 81-yard run like he did against LSU. LSU, those offensive numbers weren't great. They still managed 35 points. So, Josh, does this feel like a situation where even if Georgia's defense is good, I don't think they're elite plus like they've been, Florida's still going to scrape together some points in this game. Georgia's not pitching a shutout, which means Georgia's going to need to score decently to win it.
I think that's fair, and it has a lot to do with who Anthony Richardson is as a quarterback. He's a very, very high ceiling guy. He can make any throw in the field. The problem is he often won't. And from an athleticism standpoint, he's the most athletic quarterback in the country. One of the most athletic quarterbacks of the last 5 to 10 years. But his limitations in the passing game, both from a standpoint of understanding the offense, as well as just mechanical consistency, really hold that offense back because teams can afford to let Anthony Richardson take shots on single coverage, knowing more often than not he's probably going to miss, frankly. And that just changes the way you play them. But by the same token, if you play that style, that's kind of why I think they put up points the way they do, is teams play them and go, you know what? He may hit 1 or 2 over the course of the game. He may end up with a big run, but it's going to be 2 to 3 plays that we give up to Anthony Richardson. And the rest of the time we play aggressive, we play tight coverage. He's going to miss his deep shots, and we're going to stop the run, and we're going to just kind of stuff him. And we're going to drown him out for most of the game. We're going to dominate time of possession, and we're going to beat Florida. What I find interesting when you look at Florida's offense, for all the sort of negativity, there are a couple big positives. One is since the Kentucky game, they have had at least 6.5 yards per play in every single game. That's a good number. 6.5 yards per play is pretty consistent offensive performance. That's better than Georgia had against Sanford in terms of average, about the same they had against Kent State, better than they had against Missouri. I mean, whatever Georgia was in some of those games, Kent State, Missouri game, where they weren't fantastic, but they were still moving the ball, Florida has been at least that good every game. And I don't think Florida's seen on the same tier as Georgia, but that says a lot. And then also from a scoring perspective, something I want to note, this is the first top, what are they, like top 45, top 50 scoring offense nationally. In terms of points scored versus P5 competition, Florida is 44th. And from an SEC standpoint, Florida's 6th in the conference. They're between LSU and Arkansas. They've been scoring 27 points per game versus P5 teams. Something that's worth noting for Georgia in terms of their defense and how they've held up, Georgia has not played any of the teams that are in the top half of the SEC in scoring offense versus P5 competition. What they have played is number 9 in the conference, South Carolina, number 11 in the conference, number 12 in the conference, Auburn, number 13 in the conference, Missouri, number 14 in the conference, Vanderbilt. The 3 worst teams in the conference, and South Carolina. I think there is something to be said for the fact that Florida does have a competent offense. They do have the probably the best scoring capability of anyone Georgia's played so far. I'll note that number one in scoring offense versus Power 5 is actually Georgia, and number two is Tennessee, but about a field goal behind Georgia. Interestingly, Alabama's only a field goal behind Tennessee themselves, despite some of their performances. But yeah, I mean, this is by far probably the best test in terms of overall offense, despite all their problems that Georgia's had to date. And it's a little bit of a warm-up before they get to the Tennessee game, who's, about 15, 20 points better than Florida on the offensive side of the ball. But it is enough to make you think Florida can score.
So I think it's interesting because Florida is probably more competent offensively than people want to give them credit for, because maybe they saw the Kentucky game, or maybe they just don't. They watch this Florida team and they don't know that they can put some points on the board. The issue for me, Josh, is, do you think Tennessee has a good defense, or a bad defense?
Bad defense.
Tennessee's defense is ranked 49th in scoring. Florida's is 80th. Would you have thought, maybe you would because you've done the model, but would you have thought Florida's numbers for scoring would be 80th, rushing defense 98th, passing defense 112th? Just from what you've seen Florida this year, would you have thought that?
It doesn't feel that bad. Like, I know their defense is bad, and I know they've been beat up. I think sometimes people don't understand when you start talking 80th or worse in categories, which cough those Big Ten powers right now, and we've said they're probably elite in spite of it, but the scoring offenses they've faced have all been in this 80th plus range. That's a whole other level of bad. Like, there are 131 teams in college football, and about 50 to 60 of them are G5 teams, or teams that are just non-functional, the Iowas of the world. And anytime you're in that category, you're pretty bad. So for Florida to be in the 100th plus range is kind of alarming.
Right. And these are, when we do our, Florida's ranked 112th in passing defense, we're saying in yards per attempt numbers, not total numbers, not total yardage, but 80th in scoring, 98th in rushing defense, 112th in pass defense. And Josh, this is where I get you into the model, because this is important, because the efficiency numbers matter, because Florida is about to play offensively. Defensively, they're about to play an offense that is an efficiency monster. So Vegas has got this, I think you said 20 or 22 points. What's our model got it?
Yeah, our model has this as a 17-point game. So not all that far off. And I know you say, there's a difference between 17 and 22. It's 5 points. But when you get into that realm, we're talking about a 3-possession game versus a 4-possession game. There's a lot of things, backdoor covers and whatnot, start to come into play pretty heavy. The interesting thing, I think, really comes down to some of the yardage predictions and things like that. First off, our model, it reflects the fact that Florida's defense is pretty darn bad. 109% of opponent rushing averages allowed, 101% of opponent passing averages. Those numbers compare to some of those Ole Miss teams that were really bad a couple years ago defensively. Now, we saw those get into 120% range, but the better bad Ole Miss defenses were in this realm. And that's kind of where you are. And it's usually a reflection of just general complete lack of talent, frankly. Lack of speed, athleticism. People will start to complain about tackling, they'll complain about scheme. You have guys that can't tackle because they're smaller and slower than guys in the other team. When you see the numbers like this, that's usually what this means, unless you're just completely unhinged or have no idea what you're doing. Oklahoma defensively. And I don't know that Florida's quite at that point. I think it's more a reflection of the recruiting for the past few years. I think it's interesting that Georgia isn't better than they are. 80% rushing averages, 74% passing averages. That passing number is one of the better numbers nationally. That rushing number is actually, a little bit worse than Ohio State, Michigan. It's a lot worse than Alabama right now. And that is a good number, low 80s, but those Georgia teams, like that Georgia defense last year, I think they were around 50%. That's a huge, huge difference. This is 3-4 tiers different as a rush defense. So they're good enough to slow you down, but maybe not good enough to really stop a high-level rush offense. And they're not good enough to really keep even an average running team from moving the ball some. And it's those matchups that I think kind of keep Florida from being totally run away from in this model. because Florida is mainly a run team. They skew run to pass about 4-3. Georgia, interestingly, actually throws the ball more than they run it. I'm not sure how many people realize that, almost to the same degree. And so those both kind of help out the other team. That Florida's passing defense is great, but the run defense is worse. So both teams are kind of playing to Florida's strength in terms of tendencies. The problem is that Georgia's just better. And you see 5 yards per play to about 7.8 yards per play. 5 yards per play for Florida would only be better than the Kentucky result. And Kentucky, as a game, as everyone knows, what did Florida score? They scored 16 points. You want to know where our model has to score about 16 points? It's because this is pretty close to the Kentucky result and way off really anything else. As I said, they've been averaging over 6.5 yards per play. Georgia offensively, 7.78 yards per play is a ton. That would be the largest number that Georgia's had since the South Carolina game when they ran away with that 48-7, had about 550 yards of offense. They've been under 7.5 yards, like Auburn, 7 yards per play. Missouri was only 6. So this is a pretty high number for Georgia. And I will actually flag, I'm not sure that I necessarily buy that they only score 33 with that kind of an offensive number. If you're pushing 8 yards per play and you are an efficiency-based team, it is hard to keep you from scoring a lot. I think the only reason this number isn't higher than it is really a reflection of the fact that if the other team can move the ball some, and Georgia has such methodical drives, Georgia tends to play short games. That Kent State game, the Missouri game, there were not a ton of possessions. And so that and the turnover potential that Georgia's seen at certain times is kind of keeping this game from getting larger and larger. But if you were to extrapolate this out in terms of a much longer game, a more normal length game, this is probably more like, a 45-20 kind of result, closer to the spread. I think the reason our model has this a little tighter is it just thinks basically this game is going to be a little bit shorter, and that compresses the amount that Georgia's able to, move away from, about almost a 3 yard per play advantage, which is just a huge advantage in a football game.
It's kind of wild that we're this far into the season and these two teams only have one common opponent, transitive opponent. Georgia, you mentioned their numbers. They're 19th in rushing defense. Incidentally, like Alabama's like second or third. And Alabama has their issues. We saw Mississippi State run on them a little bit Saturday. I think because of that, I think Florida's going to score some, and Georgia fans got at us a little bit, and it was fair because I think we had South Carolina scoring in like 17 to 20 points in a blowout, but we had them scoring somewhere in there. I do think I've got Florida scoring 20 here, but I have Georgia scoring 37. So 37-20 for Georgia is my pick. I think this is a big game. I think there's emotions at play. I think more than just on paper in this game. If Florida can keep their head above water for a quarter and a half, which they couldn't do last year against Georgia really, then they've got a chance to make this respectable, but I'm not picking Florida to win this one. I think Georgia's going to win it, not cover the 22. Tell me what you got.
I think Georgia's going to win it. I actually think they're going to cover. And there's two reasons for that. The first is when I think back to last year, Anthony Richardson had major issues trying to deal with Georgia's scheme. Georgia, like Alabama, runs a very complicated defense. It's hard for them to get people in a position to be able to play it. When they're young, sometimes they have issues and they can be spotty. When they're not, they can really get in rhythm. And if you have a young quarterback that isn't quite in sync yet, they can really drown playing those defenses because they run constant mixes of zone and man coverage. I always hate when you see people talk about like the zone coverage rate for someone out of that Saban tree, because it almost tells me they don't really completely understand how these defenses work. Yeah, they do run straight zone coverage, but that pattern match concept defense is actually designed to switch whether it's man or zone depending on the same call on formation, and they don't run the same scheme on both sides of the field quite often. So it's really, really complicated, but because of that, quarterbacks really struggle with it. And so I think that's going to really probably, again, give Anthony Richardson fits, combined with the fact that Georgia has a lot more athleticism on the defensive side of the ball than anything they're used to. The other thing that I will say is a big factor that we didn't really talk about to this point, and I haven't heard a lot of national chatter about it to this point myself. Jalen Carter was expected to be back by the Florida game, and we had the bye week. I haven't really seen anything, and I was trying to dig into reports of where exactly he's at. But there's a chance that Jalen Carter may play in this game, and for all the talk about their run defense, that might be the best run-stopping defensive lineman in the country. And if you get him back to combine with all this, that pushes it even further in my mind. So I'm actually going to predict this game to be 42-13 in Georgia's favor. I just think this is one that could easily run away from Florida. I wouldn't shock me if Florida sticks in this game. If Carter's not available, if Florida has the ability to run the ball to where they don't really need to throw, which is something they couldn't do last year at all, which is why everything imploded, then I think, yeah, they might be able to lean on Georgia and score some points. And then it comes down to how much can Georgia find rhythm on the offensive side of the football. I personally think Stetson Bennett's probably been dealing with a similar shoulder issues as he had a couple years ago when everyone turned on him. He's not a big enough, strong enough guy to play quarterback well if he's not healthy. He needs his whole body to rip into throws with velocity and accuracy. But with that time off and everything kind of going their way, I think there's everything lined up here for Georgia to kind of run away with this one.
All right, y'all, let us know in the comments what you think this score is going to be. And let us know what you think about Georgia to this point. Is it the Oregon, Georgia? Is it the Kent State, Missouri, Georgia? Like Josh said, I think it's a mixture of both. But I do agree. I think you put it a good way, Josh. This year especially, judging a team by their worst game is a little bit silly. All right, y'all, thanks so much. Have a great week. God bless.